The golden hues of the late afternoon sun filtered through the tall oak trees lining a tranquil neighborhood street in Savannah, Georgia. The quiet suburb buzzed softly with life, children's laughter echoed from front yards, and the scent of early dinners wafted from open windows. Amid this peaceful scene, a small moving truck rumbled into a cul-de-sac, its bed stacked high with furniture, cardboard boxes, and other household items. Inside the truck's cab, Ethan and Sophie Campbell, a couple in their late 20s, exchanged uneasy glances. In the back seat, their 8-month-old son, Noah, cooed softly from his car seat, unaware of the heavy emotions filling the air. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly, glancing briefly at the rearview mirror. Sophie, her gaze fixed on the Labrador retriever nestled among the boxes in the truck bed, broke the silence. "She's been so quiet the entire trip," Sophie murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you think she knows what's happening?" Ethan sighed, his tone subdued. "I don't know. Dogs don't think the way we do, but maybe she does." The Labrador, Rosie, had been an integral part of their lives for 6 years. Adopted from a rescue shelter shortly after their wedding, Rosie had witnessed every milestone alongside them, from buying their first home to weathering career changes, and most recently, welcoming Noah into the family. But as Rosie aged, her health began to deteriorate. With Noah's arrival and the mounting demands of parenthood, Ethan and Sophie found themselves struggling to juggle it all. Sophie's parents had suggested rehoming Rosie, reasoning that it might ease the burden. "I hate this," Sophie whispered as Ethan slowed the truck in front of a modest house with a sprawling backyard. "I feel like we're abandoning her." Ethan rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not abandoning her," he said softly. "We're giving her a better life. They'll know how to take care of her, sophomore. She'll be happy here." They unloaded Rosie with care. The metallic clink of her leash echoed as Ethan clipped it to her collar. Rosie wagged her tail faintly, her once lustrous chocolate-colored coat catching the golden rays of sunlight. Sophie knelt beside her, running her fingers gently through Rosie's soft fur. "You've been so good to us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I hope you'll forgive us." As they approached the front door, it opened to reveal a kind-faced woman in her 60s. "You must be the Campbells," she said warmly. "I'm Caroline. It's lovely to meet you." Ethan and Sophie offered hesitant smiles. "Thank you for taking Rosie," Sophie said, her voice breaking slightly. She's a wonderful dog." Caroline smiled reassuringly. "She's in good hands here. We have lots of space, and she'll have other dogs for company." Rosie hesitated as Ethan handed over the leash, her deep brown eyes searching his face as though pleading with him not to go. For a moment, Ethan's resolve wavered, but Sophie gently touched his arm, reminding him of the decision they had made. As they drove away, the truck's cabin was heavy with silence. Sophie stared out the window, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ethan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. From the back seat, Noah babbled softly, blissfully unaware of the emotional weight surrounding his parents. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan swallowed hard. "She'll be okay," he replied, though the words felt hollow. "She has to be." Neither of them noticed Rosie standing at the edge of Caroline's yard, her gaze fixed on the disappearing truck. The house felt strangely quiet without Rosie's soft paws patting across the hardwood floors or the rhythmic thump of her tail against the couch. Even Noah, usually calm and content, seemed fussier than usual, as if he too felt the absence of their golden retriever. Sophie stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee, her eyes fixed on the window. The silence in the home, once comforting, now felt hollow and heavy, marked by Rosie's absence. Ethan stepped into the room, loosening his tie after a long day at work. He paused when he noticed Sophie's somber expression. "You okay?" he asked gently, leaning against the counter. Sophie sighed, her shoulders slumping. I can't stop thinking about her, she admitted, her voice shaky. What if she's scared? Or confused? What if she thinks we abandoned her? Her words caught in her throat as she blinked back tears. Ethan pressed his lips into a thin line, guilt flickering across his face. We made the right choice, Soph, he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. Rosie will adjust. Maria will take good care of her. She has everything she needs there. Sophie nodded faintly, but the weight in her chest remained. I hope so, she murmured, the uncertainty in her voice betraying her doubt. That night, as they prepared for bed, a faint scratching noise broke through the silence. Sophie froze mid-step, her heart racing. Did you hear that? She whispered. Ethan nodded, his brow furrowing with concern. Stay here. I'll check it out, he said, grabbing a flashlight. He moved cautiously toward the front door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he opened it, the sight before him made his breath catch. There, sitting on the porch, was Rosie. Her golden fur was damp and matted, her leash dragging behind her. She looked up at Ethan with wide, pleading eyes. Rosie? Ethan whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Sophie appeared behind him, gasping as she saw their dog. How? How did she get here? She stammered, her voice trembling. Rosie wagged her tail weakly, her exhaustion evident. Sophie dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around the dog. You came back, she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. Ethan shook his head in amazement. She was miles away, he said softly. How did she even find us? Sophie stroked Rosie's fur, her heart aching with both guilt and relief. She must have followed the truck. She came all this way to find us. They brought Rosie inside, wiping her down with a towel and offering her food and water. She ate slowly, her body trembling from the long journey. Sophie sat beside her on the floor, stroking her fur as Noah babbled happily in his playpen. She looks so tired, Sophie whispered, her voice heavy with emotion. Ethan, we can't take her back. Not after this. Ethan leaned against the wall, his mind racing. Soph, you know why we made that decision. We're barely managing as it is. And you think this doesn't matter? Sophie snapped, her voice rising. She walked miles, through who knows what, to come back to us. How can we just send her away again? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The next morning, they called Maria to explain what had happened. Maria sounded concerned. She seemed fine here, Maria said. She ate, played with the other dogs, but maybe she just couldn't let go of you. Sophie's heart ached at the thought. She walked all the way back to us, she said softly. I don't think we can take her away again. Maria hesitated before replying. I understand. But you know this won't be easy. Rosie will need a lot of care, and patience. We'll manage, Sophie said firmly. Thank you for understanding. With Rosie officially back in their care, Sophie and Ethan adjusted their lives to make room for her once more. Ethan began waking up early to take her on gentle morning walks, and Sophie ensured Rosie had cozy spots to rest while Noah played. It wasn't easy, juggling a baby, work, and an aging dog, but Rosie's quiet loyalty reminded them why they needed to try. Rosie nudged the toy with her nose, her tail wagging faintly as she joined Noah in his play. Ethan chuckled, his heart warming at the sight. You really are part of the family, aren't you? He said softly, scratching behind her ears. Rosie barked gently, as if to say, always. Despite the newfound joy she brought back into their home, doubt still lingered in Ethan's mind. Late one evening, as he sat on the porch with Rosie by his side, he whispered, Did we make the right choice bringing you back? What if we can't give you everything you need? Rosie rested her head on his knee, her warm, soulful eyes meeting his. In that quiet moment, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though Rosie was telling him that simply being together was enough. Rosie's return had undeniably brought a renewed sense of unity to the family. However, the challenges of balancing work, caring for Noah, and managing Rosie's growing health needs began to weigh heavily on Ethan and Sophie. The golden retriever required more attention and energy than they had anticipated. Though they loved her deeply, the demands of her care pushed their already packed schedules to the limit. One evening, Ethan came home late from work to find Sophie in the kitchen. She looked pale and exhausted, her movements slow and deliberate as she tried to prepare dinner. Rosie lay in her usual spot near the counter, her breathing labored after a difficult day. Noah fussed in his high chair, his cries blending with the clatter of pots and pans. Sophie turned to Ethan, her voice strained as she said, "We need to talk." Ethan set down his briefcase, his brow furrowing with concern. "What's wrong?" Sophie wiped her hands on a towel, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know if we're doing the right thing, Ethan. Rosie's getting worse, and we can barely keep up. What if we're hurting her by keeping her here?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She's part of this family, sophomore. We can't just give up on her." "I'm not saying we give up," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "But what if she'd be better off somewhere else? Somewhere with more resources? Somewhere she can get the care she really needs?" Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden thud. They turned to see Rosie struggling to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. Sophie rushed to her side, her heart racing. "Rosie, it's okay," she said soothingly, helping the dog onto a soft blanket. "You're okay." But as Sophie cradled Rosie's head, her tears spilled over. She looked up at Ethan, her voice breaking. "We can't ignore this anymore." Ethan knelt beside them, his throat tight with emotion. "We'll take her to the vet tomorrow," he said quietly. "We'll figure it out." The next morning, Ethan and Sophie brought Rosie to the veterinary clinic. The waiting room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of magazines and soft murmurs of conversation. Rosie rested her head on Ethan's lap, her eyes half closed, her energy waning. When Dr. Harper, their veterinarian, entered the exam room, her expression was warm but tinged with concern. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, her tone gentle. Ethan explained Rosie's symptoms, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his chest. Dr. Harper listened intently before performing a thorough examination. Her brow furrowed as she listened to Rosie's heart and checked her joints. "She's showing signs of advanced arthritis," Dr. Harper said softly. "Her heart is also weaker than it should be. These are common issues for dogs her age, but they require ongoing care." Sophie swallowed hard. "What kind of care?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harper outlined the necessary steps: medications, dietary adjustments, and regular therapy sessions to improve Rosie's mobility. "It's manageable," she assured them, "but it will take time, patience, and resources." Ethan and Sophie exchanged a glance, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on them. Though the path ahead seemed daunting, they both knew one thing for certain: they would do everything in their power to help Rosie. But they both knew the answer. "We'll do it," Ethan said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Sophie threw themselves into caring for Rosie. They created a detailed schedule for her medications, adjusted her diet based on the veterinarian's recommendations, and even installed a small ramp to make it easier for her to climb onto the couch. It wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of frustration, and days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them. But every time they looked at Rosie, her gentle eyes reminded them why they were doing it. One afternoon, as Sophie watched Noah crawl across the living room floor, Rosie slowly rose to her feet. Despite the stiffness in her joints, she made her way over to Noah and nudged his toy closer with her nose. Noah let out a delighted giggle, clapping his little hands in excitement. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "She's not just our dog, Ethan," she said softly. "She's Noah's protector." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "And she always will be," he said, scratching behind Rosie's ears. Despite their renewed commitment, the lingering question of whether they were truly doing enough for Rosie never left their minds. The stress of balancing work, parenting, and Rosie's medical needs finally came to a head during a family gathering. Sophie's mother, noticing the strain on her daughter's face, voiced her concerns. "You're taking on too much," her mother said, her tone firm. "Between the baby and work, you're spreading yourselves too thin. Have you considered letting Rosie go?" Sophie's jaw tightened. "She's family, Mom. We're not giving up on her," she said, her voice resolute. Her mother sighed, her expression softening. "I just don't want to see you burn out." Sophie turned to Ethan, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not giving up," she repeated. "Right, Ethan?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, the weight of their responsibilities pressing heavily on him. Then he nodded. "Right." That night, as they lay in bed, Ethan turned to Sophie. "You're right," he said quietly. "Rosie is family, and we'll do whatever it takes to keep her with us." Sophie smiled, her hand finding his. "Thank you," she whispered. As they drifted off to sleep, Rosie lay curled at the foot of the bed, her breathing soft and steady. For the first time in weeks, Ethan and Sophie felt a sense of peace, knowing they were facing the challenges together. Life for the family settled into a challenging but fulfilling rhythm. Between work, caring for Noah, and managing Rosie's needs, Ethan and Sophie found themselves stretched thin but united in their efforts. The weight of their commitment was ever present, but so were the small victories that reminded them why they had made this choice. One crisp morning, as Ethan prepared Rosie's medication, Sophie noticed something that made her chest tighten. Rosie seemed more sluggish than usual. Her movements were slow and deliberate, and she struggled to finish her breakfast. A pang of worry shot through Sophie. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "something's wrong." Ethan crouched beside Rosie, gently stroking her fur. "She's probably just tired," he said, though his tone betrayed his own concern. "We've been doing everything right, haven't we?" Sophie nodded, but the unease in her stomach didn't subside. "I think we should call Dr. Harper," she said. Later that day, they brought Rosie back to the veterinary clinic. Dr. Harper greeted them with her usual calm demeanor, but her expression grew serious as she examined Rosie. After a thorough checkup, Dr. Harper spoke gently. "Rosie has developed fluid buildup around her heart," she explained. "It's a common issue in older dogs, especially given her condition. We can try draining the fluid and adjusting her medications, but it's a delicate process." Ethan's heart sank. "What does that mean for her?" he asked, his voice tight. Dr. Harper sighed softly. "It means her time may be more limited than we'd like," she said. "But with the right care, we can help her maintain a good quality of life." Ethan and Sophie exchanged a glance, their hearts heavy but resolute. They both knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to do everything they could for Rosie. "She can still have a good quality of life," Dr. Harper said, her voice calm but tinged with gravity. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she gently stroked Rosie's head. "We'll do whatever it takes," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "Just tell us what to do." Ethan nodded silently, his jaw tight with determination. The drive home was heavy with silence. Noah babbled softly in his car seat, blissfully unaware of his parents' turmoil. Rosie lay quietly in the back, her eyes half closed but still alert, her tail flicking faintly every so often. Ethan glanced at Sophie, who stared out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Finally, she broke the silence. "She's not just a dog, Ethan," Sophie said, her voice breaking. She's part of us. I can't imagine losing her. Ethan reached for her hand, gripping it firmly. His own emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but he kept his tone steady. "We'll take it one day at a time," he said softly. "That's all we can do." The following weeks were marked by a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan and Sophie worked together to care for Rosie, ensuring she received her treatments and medications on time. They adjusted their routines to prioritize her needs, even as their own exhaustion mounted. Each day was a balancing act between work, parenting Noah, and ensuring Rosie was comfortable. One evening, Ethan returned home late from work. He found Sophie sitting on the floor with Noah and Rosie. The baby giggled as Rosie gently nudged one of his toys closer with her nose. Her tail wagged faintly, and for a moment, she seemed like her old self. Sophie looked up at Ethan, her eyes brimming with tears. "She still has so much life in her," Sophie said softly. "Even after everything, she's still here." Ethan knelt beside them, his hand resting on Rosie's back. "She's a fighter," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like you." Despite their best efforts, Rosie's condition continued to decline. Her once bright, expressive eyes grew dimmer, and her energy waned with each passing day. One morning, as Ethan prepared for work, Rosie struggled to climb the stairs. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she finally collapsed, unable to continue. "Rosie!" Ethan exclaimed, rushing to her side. He scooped her up in his arms, his heart pounding. "It's okay, girl. I've got you." Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale with worry. "Ethan, we need to call Dr. Harper again," she said urgently. Later that afternoon, Dr. Harper arrived at their home. Her presence brought a sense of calm amidst the chaos. She examined Rosie carefully, her expression solemn. "She's tired," Dr. Harper said gently. "Her body is working hard to keep up, but there's only so much we can do." Ethan and Sophie exchanged a glance, their hearts breaking in unison. "Is she in pain?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Dr. Harper assured them. "But she's nearing the end of her journey. It's important to make her as comfortable as possible." That night, the family gathered around Rosie in the living room. Noah sat beside her, babbling softly as Ethan and Sophie stroked her fur. The weight of their love for Rosie filled the room, a quiet acknowledgement of all she had given them. "You've been the best dog we could have ever asked for," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "Thank you for everything, girl." Sophie leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Rosie's head. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "We love you so, so much." Rosie rested her head on Ethan's lap, her breathing steady but shallow. The family made a silent promise to cherish every remaining moment with her. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of love and reflection. Ethan and Sophie dedicated every waking moment to making Rosie's final days as peaceful as possible. They spoiled her with her favorite treats, wrapped her in soft blankets, and spent hours simply sitting by her side. One sunny afternoon, Ethan decided to take Rosie to the park she had loved as a younger dog. She had loved it as a younger dog. It had been years since they had visited, but Ethan wanted to give Rosie one last chance to enjoy the grass beneath her paws and feel the gentle breeze against her fur. Sophie joined him, carrying Noah in her arms. Together, they laid out a blanket beneath a tall oak tree, with Rosie resting beside them. Her tail wagged faintly as she watched other dogs playing in the distance. "She looks happy," Sophie said softly, running her fingers through Rosie's soft fur. "I think she knows how much she's loved." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I hope she does." That evening, back at home, Rosie seemed unusually tired. She lay curled in her favorite spot by the fireplace, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan and Sophie sat on the floor beside her, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that her time was drawing near. As the night wore on, Rosie lifted her head one last time, her eyes meeting theirs with a look of pure love and gratitude. Ethan stroked her gently, his voice trembling. "You've been so good to us, Rosie. It's okay to rest now." Tears streamed down Sophie's face as she whispered, "We'll always love you." With a soft sigh, Rosie laid her head back down and closed her eyes. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the faint sounds of Noah stirring in his crib. The loss of Rosie left a void in the home that was impossible to fill. Her absence was felt in the quiet mornings, the empty space at the foot of the bed, and the stillness of the living room where she had once napped. But even in their grief, Ethan and Sophie found solace in the memories she had left behind. "She taught us so much," Sophie said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "About love, loyalty, and what it means to be a family." Ethan nodded, his eyes misting. "She brought out the best in us. Even when things were hard, she reminded us of what really matters." A few weeks later, Sophie received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo of Rosie along with a small note from Dr. Harper. The note read, "Rosie was more than a pet. She was a testament to the love and care you gave her. Thank you for giving her the life she deserved." Sophie placed the photo on the mantel, her heart swelling with both sorrow and gratitude. "She'll always be with us," she said, her voice steady. Ethan wrapped an arm around her, his gaze fixed on the photo. "Always." One day, as they strolled through the park with Noah, Sophie noticed a small dog sitting alone near a bench. Its fur was matted, and it looked timid, but there was something familiar in its eyes, a quiet plea for love and safety. Ethan followed her gaze and smiled faintly. "What do you think?" Sophie knelt beside the dog, holding out her hand. The dog hesitated, then inched closer, its tail wagging tentatively. Sophie looked up at Ethan, her eyes shining. "I think Rosie would have wanted us to do this." Ethan nodded, his heart full. "Then let's give this one a home." As they walked back to the house with their new companion in tow, Noah babbled happily, and the dog trotted beside them, its eyes bright with hope. The family knew they couldn't replace Rosie, but they could honor her memory by continuing to share the love she had inspired in them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in golden light, Ethan and Sophie felt a sense of peace, knowing that Rosie's legacy would live on, not just in their hearts, but in the lives they continued to touch. The story of Rosie teaches us 3 invaluable lessons applicable to everyday life. First, unconditional love and loyalty are not just limited to humans but can be found in the bond we share with animals. Rosie's unwavering devotion reminds us to cherish those who stand by us, especially in challenging times. Second, resilience and hope emerge as powerful tools for navigating life's struggles. Despite the obstacles Ethan and Sophie faced, their determination to care for Rosie demonstrated the strength that love can provide, even during the hardest moments. Lastly, the story highlights the importance of honoring legacies and spreading kindness. By opening their hearts to another dog, Ethan and Sophie proved that healing and honoring loved ones can come from acts of empathy and giving. In life, we are often faced with loss, but through love and compassion, we can create meaning and continue to inspire others. What do you think about Rosie's journey and the story of Ethan and Sophie's family? Would you be willing to overcome challenges to keep an important 4-legged friend in your life? Thank you for listening, and see you in the next story.